maybe just to kick off the conversation, could you share with us, when you walk into a COP pavilion or COP negotiation, who really holds power in the room, and how do smaller countries like Malaysia make themselves heard?
Assalamualaikum and a very good morning, Sri Jamila, and all the distinguished audience that we have today. Well, I think in reality, when you walk into a negotiation room, the big, I would quote unquote, the big countries, traditionally the US, the EU, China, they tend to have a lot of sway. And I can say, in 2023, when the COP was in Dubai, and our pavilion was actually in the same building as China, and literally you could witness how that COP was negotiated when you see John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart going up and down the corridors, literally. And it was when they agreed that you had an agreement. Right? Before they came to an agreement, things did not move. But there are other blocks. Obviously, for the developing world, G77 has always been critical, or now it's known as G77 plus China. Then you have ASEAN, you have the African Union, so on and so forth. What we found out, this was my experience, is G77, the challenge is that because it's so big. And in reality, in G77, which is supposed to be supposedly the Northern Line or the developing world, you have Singapore, you have Qatar, you have Zimbabwe, you have Pakistan. So it's a very diverse, different countries with diverse needs. I think the small island states, for example, they have organized quite well. So we have our own challenge in ASEAN because Singapore, they prefer to see themselves as a small island state, right? So, but that's the reality. This is diplomacy because there's nothing to stop you. Just as we are in G77, we are in ASEAN, and so on and so forth. There's nothing to stop you from being in multiple groups. And I think for Malaysia, we've been trying to find that sweet spot. G77 used to be very powerful. We used to play a big role. But over the years, there has been a debate, even within Malaysia, that we saw that sometimes G77 can sort of slow our ambition and whether we want to be seen. And in reality, just like I was talking about Singapore and Qatar and UAE, Malaysia is a high middle income country. Within the end of the decade, we will be a developed country. So in that sense, where do we fit? That remains a challenge in our negotiations. But yeah, in 2023, it was China and US that had the big sway. Obviously, 2024, when I was in Azerbaijan, we did talk to the US, but nobody really listened to them because by then people knew that they were withdrawing from COP. And I think that a lot of it basically is driven now by EU and China in many ways.
And now Malaysia, of course, has the ambition to be in G20, and that will be another grouping as well that's quite powerful in trying to move the conversation. But share with us an example of a time when the outcome of the negotiation was very different from the way it was portrayed publicly here in Malaysia. Has there been that happening before, like the media portraying one thing, but what's actually happening is very different?
Well, specifically I can't recall, but I think the challenge has always been, the whole, how do you go, literally, the devil is in the details. And for better or for worse, negotiators are very smart. You have this big amounts coming up that the developed world is committed to providing X and X amount of money to the developing world, for example. But then, part of it is government grants, but there's also on loans, and there's some, they try to include even, things from the private sector, so not entirely from the governments of the developed world, for example. And then there's a lot of conditionalities and all that, and even then, I can say that often countries have fallen short, even of the supposedly compulsory amount. And normally the governments are very smart at trying to, these are, if they are lawyers, they're probably the top lawyers in the world. They find ways to really water down those commitments, and I think that has been the challenge to see. And then obviously when you report, it depends. When a government wants to portray as something as positive, they highlight all the big numbers without telling or explaining about the details, which can be a bit more, there's a lot of conditions attached to these big numbers.
Picking up on commitments, what you mentioned at the last COP in Azerbaijan, Malaysia's position was quote-unquote ambitious and forward-looking, but critics argue that the targets were actually quite modest. So how do you respond to these gaps in perception?
Yeah, so well, I think one of the things that we had, like for example, with regards to Malaysia, our commitments under the NDC roadmap, we came up with this. One is that, on one hand, it's all unconditional, the reduction on GHG, but the way it's measured on 2005 numbers is based on, GDP units and all that. So the way it's defined, basically it provides room for Malaysia to increase its emission, but the idea is that less emission per unit of economic growth per capita, right? There's a whole thing, and that's why for me, obviously when I came in, we wanted to find ways to make it more meaningful. And I do think there's always this huge debate about where does a country like Malaysia, as a high middle income country, where do we belong? Can we still argue for assistance and all that? Or should we behave like, a rich country? But we do believe that, for a country like Malaysia, when you have assets like our rainforests, and the benefits are being shared across the world, not just in Malaysia, and I do believe that you have to look at the history where, for example, our oil and gas has been exploited for probably 100 years, but only by our own corporates in the last 50 years, right? So where do we place ourselves? And I think for Malaysia, we agree that we can't go down and water down our ambition, but there has to be the recognition of that historic debt that the rich countries owe us, right? Because they've cut their forests, they've cut our forests, and they've taken our resources, and they've reached that level of living standards. So when we wanted to articulate our vision, we had to find that spot in the middle of this, between being very high ambition, but also being, just talking about the problems and the problems that we face as still pretty much a developing country.
And often, COP is described, quite superlatives, right? Historic, groundbreaking. But if you look at the fine print, it actually tells you a different story. You alluded to that with the Loss and Damage Fund. As a minister then, how conscious were you of the language you use, and what should journalists actually watch out for?
Well, I think, as when you are a minister, for me, and I think journalists have their own challenges with regards to this. It's, on one hand, you need to give hope. You need to show that there's progress. Because if you just talk about doom and gloom, you have the Donald Trumps of the world, and that's fine. That's not fine, but it is what it is. But then on the other hand, you have people who feel that it's too late, right? And then they feel that, why do we need to go to COP and all that to negotiate when things are already too bad, too late? So when you're there, you recognize that we are talking about the entire planet coming together, trying to find a common ground, and they are bound to be. You can't address everything, and you can't meet all the expectations, but you do want to show that there's progress. On the other hand, I think what we've been trying to portray as well is that, publicly we want to continue to remind the developed world of what they owe to the rest of the planet. I'm realistic, we've gone through this again and again and again. It's like a rich uncle who's also very stingy with the money, right? It is what it is. But I think that has to be reminded, that moral debt that they owe us. And obviously when you have things like the wars, the conflicts and all that, and that was repeated again and again by most developing countries, that hypocrisy also has to be, they did not want to give us money for climate, but they are willing to spend trillions of dollars on conflict. So that is the language that we try to use, but privately, when we negotiate, obviously, we know that there are practical issues, and we know that there are objectives and all that, but how we communicate is obviously slightly different.
Okay. Maybe if I can ask you to give some advice, how should journalists distinguish between what a government says in the plenary versus the compromises made behind closed doors?
Well, I think one is that there's a lot of well-meaning people. They can be politicians, they can be civil servants, they can be members of civil society. COP, whatever it is, I think some people obviously find that that's the problem, but I think it has become, it is a phenomenon on its own, right? And you have now, they are trying to get young people to be negotiators and all that. So I do believe that as journalists, you should try to cultivate your sources. They may not be on record, or they may not want to be named, or it can be just background info, but it can give you an understanding. It is very, very, when I first became a minister, and I think now that I'm going through this, I had to do some reading up, when I saw the questions. It is a whole different thing altogether, right? But I understand, this is global diplomacy. You need to use certain words, certain phrases, but it can seem very removed from the ordinary businesses of normal people. The language that they use, right, it's very technical and all that. So, but if you can get a few people and compare notes, and because for some of them, they may not be happy with they may have certain agendas, and if you can build that relationship and try to tell the story behind the official press statements and official country positions and all that, I think that will enable you to tell a better story, right? And there are a lot of people in the team, whether they're politicians or civil servants, who are willing to open up and share. So I think that is what is most important, so that you understand why a certain position was arrived, what compromises were there, what blocks were involved, whether fossil fuel industries or countries, they had certain things that drove them to argue a certain idea and so on and so forth.
Now, you are very much involved with the government of Brazil, and COP30 is approaching. Where, in your opinion, should we expect to see the most contested battles, and how should journalists prepare to cover for them?
Well, I think Brazil, particularly under this administration, under the Lula administration, and with Minister Marina, they have tried to become a very vocal voice for the developing world. They have their own, I guess like most countries in the world, they have their own battles with the Trump administration right now. But they are also trying to bring a lot on the issue of nature and biodiversity into the climate discourse, right? Because sometimes, I mean, although you trace back whether it's the Convention for Biodiversity or whether it's the Convention of Climate Change and all that, it goes all the way back to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. But you do see they have sort of grown differently, those two sectors, climate change and biodiversity. But I think Brazil, they are the Tropical Forest Fund and all that, they're trying to link it together and going beyond, what we've seen before with this carbon credits, additionality and all that, which has always been, I would argue, the definition has always been a bit more favorable to the developed world, right? So they're trying to bring a new argument to that, and I think that is one thing that would be quite interesting. And I believe it's it's a bit more richer. It's richer when you see them trying to bring biodiversity and nature together and climate together, because climate can be very abstract and a bit difficult to talk about. But yeah, I mean, it's the ongoing, obviously, the battles between the developed and developing world and the other part. And this is why I think Brazil also has its challenges, because similar to Malaysia, Brazil also has a huge fossil fuel industry. So where do we, what we've achieved in Dubai about transitioning away from fossil fuels, where is the progress? Because I think with all due respect to Azerbaijan, I don't think they managed to put that argument properly. And I think Brazil, with their being a major G20 country and a major player in diplomacy for many, many decades, I think they will be able to do that. But how they're able to address that tension between the fossil fuel industry and what we need to do for climate, that will be the big question mark.
Now, talking about tensions in the fossil fuel industry, Malaysia itself is an oil-producing nation, and you would have seen, during the Climate Action Council as well, that the Prime Minister made it clear that exploration will continue, despite the fact that we really need to move swiftly to renewable energy. Do you see, in the Asia region, not just Malaysia, you also have Indonesia, India, all oil-producing countries, do you see this tension and compromises that governments have to make because of the oil industry?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think for Malaysia, overall, probably, in our budget, oil and gas contribute about 20 to 30% of the government budget, right? So they play a big role. I have to say that Petronas in Malaysia has been rather sophisticated, and they are a bit more adept at looking at the issues of sustainability and climate and all that. But what I do see, the challenge is more so, my personal experience is with regards to plastics. So, I mean, I've been trying to push Malaysia to be more ambitious, to be a bit more forward. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not an NGO activist. I am a politician. I speak for the government. At that time when I was a minister, I understand that there are certain, we operate within certain frameworks. But I do believe that we have to show ambition and we need to go further. And I think one of the challenges that we saw, climate was I think not so bad. What was worse was plastics. And recently in the Global Plastic Treaty, similarly, we just went, and there's this, basically the cartel is basically the oil producing countries, US, then you have the Gulf states and so on and so forth. Again, I think EU, some of the African countries, they take a super idealized position, which can be very difficult as well. But if you look at positions of Norway is also an oil and gas country. They're not EU. But they take a bit more, their position is a bit more sophisticated. So I was arguing, why can't we, position ourselves with the Norways of the world? When they always talk about, and there's a lot, every time you meet, they, sometimes some of the ministry officials, they within the environment ministry, they keep talking about the importance of industry. And I mean, I say if you're from the industrial ministry, I completely understand, right? But if you're from the environment ministry, we have to be thinking more about the environment, right? And when they talk about industry, we always tell, I mean, yes, there's oil and gas and there's the plastic industry. But we tend to forget about the Nestle's, the Coca-Colas, the Unilevers of the world, which is also industry, but they are a bit more agnostic. All they want is something that's cheap, that is clean, and which can sell, can be a container to their products. But we don't engage them enough. And in fact, the retailers, the food FMCG sector, they are the ones who are pushing for global plastic treaty because they want certainty. If there is a position that, okay, we will have a reduction of plastic, I don't know, 20% in the next 10 years, then they know what to do. But now, you go to different countries, even in Malaysia, different states, different cities, they have different requirements, and that's the problem, right? But if the whole world can agree, and maybe developed world move at a faster pace, developing world slightly slow, those can be discussed. And to be fair, I mean, I've seen what excited me was to see that actually EU and they've actually moderated the position. But we missed that opportunity. And that's where, to me, we get stuck in this, we feel that we are hostage to the oil and gas industry.
And is it possible that maybe we don't send the right negotiators to these meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem. And I think for environment, we have had in the past, we have ozone, we have and a few other issues, land and all that. But overall, it has not been as developed as climate. So, like in my ministry, we have a climate change division, and we have an I forgot the names, but yeah, there's an environmental division. But the climate change division has been, they've gone to all these very high-level, challenging meetings year after year, probably like over the past 10 years, especially. But environment less so, right? So when I look for the best negotiators and all that, we tend to bring them into the climate change division. And obviously, I mean, the industry is always there at these negotiations, which to me is fine. But that's where we were trying to. There was this huge debate. Why can't we have people from civil society as well and all that, right? And yeah, that was where we couldn't really. We didn't manage to do enough, I think.
Well, as a health professional, I would argue that, for example, the tobacco industry is not allowed into World Health Assembly. Why is it that governments are not demanding that the fossil fuel lobbyists are not allowed at COP? Similarly, the plastic industries are not allowed at the INC negotiations. Why can't Malaysia raise its voice to say we need to make sure that the right people are in the room for the negotiations?
I mean, well, I believe that there is room for the industry, but it has to be properly transparent, regulated, there has to be real declaration and all that. The problem that we see today, as you rightly pointed out, probably, the fossil fuel reps are much better equipped. They know how to negotiate and all that, right? And the challenge is, when you have someone who's new to the department, you may come from, some random department, customs or whatever, from a different department that's not related to the environment. You come in, you're going overseas. Then you just fall back on the industry position. And that's, so I understand, ideally, I guess, to totally stop, but I believe we can consider some form of, some middle ground there, but what we have today is certainly very much skewed, at least in the Malaysian context.
So what advice, and what role do you think journalists in Asia, we have a room full of Asian journalists here, what role can they play in shifting the narratives dominated by voices in the global north? Because I like to think that we should hospice the North. I think it's time for the Global South to rise. Because a lot of, we're talking about the geopolitical situation right now. The West has no legitimacy talking about democracy. It has no legitimacy now talking about, climate change and so forth. So what would you say to the journalists today? How do you now position the Global South, in media and in publications?
Yeah, I do believe that this is a golden opportunity. Because there's a few, of course. One is, you have the global north that totally do not want to talk about the environment, or totally do not believe in climate science and all that. That's one. But two, you also have those who talk about it. Overall, I have no problems to work with them and all that. A lot of well-meaning people there. But you do see, I give you an example. Deforestation in the EU is only defined as when the forest is changed for agriculture use. If it's changed for any other use, it's not deforestation under the EUDR rules. Why? Because, and this is where countries in Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia particularly, or Brazil, when you are involved in palm oil, you fall foul of that. I'm not defending the palm oil industry, but I'm just saying that, okay, that's bad, but if you change a forest into a city or something else, then that's fine. Yes, agriculture is a major problem, right? But the problem is, they have already deforested many years, so they don't fall foul of that definition. When we do that, then we fall foul. And this is where to be. We need all the voices from the South to be able to point to the inconsistencies. So when we develop as the developing world, where is the room for us to develop? Obviously, we do not want to take their template, because their template is flawed, but we have to be given room, and that's where the idea of planetary justice and all that is very central, so that our people can also be fed and all that. So I think that this is a golden opportunity, because with what's happening in, people are, yesterday the Prime Minister of Spain, they said that the way the West has responded on Gaza, it shows that they can't talk anything about Ukraine anymore, because people point out to that hypocrisy. Right? So for me, and this is to show that we're not talking about, we're not arguing for the sake of the palm oil industry or to destroy the forest or for the fossil fuel. But that argument of justice is very crucial. And at the end of the day, we all know, you look at climate change, only one country has, Kyoto Protocol, it's the US that did not join. Paris Agreement, only one government that joined, left, joined again, and left again, and that's the US. Right? So, and we know that historically they are the biggest polluters. So, but we just have to point it out. And I do believe that that is one way where we can build our moral strength. But also to remind our governments that we do not want to be another US. That should not be the path of the developing world. We have to show that we want to do things differently, and the media will play a key role. Because politicians, being a politician myself, all this is very complicated. They will find the best way to win votes. As you've seen in the West or in the developed world, that may not be necessarily, hand in hand with what the environment needs. So that is where the media needs to play that role, and to educate the public. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about your bread and butter issue or the planet, is actually very much interlinked. But today we are given this view that, because of all the things that we're doing for the planet, things are getting more expensive, we are losing jobs and all that. It's a very convenient argument, but that's not the real story, right? And that's where the job of the journalist comes.
So I now want to open the floor to questions from the journalists themselves to you, and also give you an opportunity to ask them questions. So